Hi, my name is Cruz, and today I want to talk about motion in photography. How do you stop motion? How do you show motion? And an advanced technique called panning, which really helps to emphasize both the speed and motion of your subject. Now let's start with the easiest option, and the one that most people initially think of when shooting a moving subject, and that is stopping motion. To stop your subject's motion, you'll need a fast enough shutter speed. Now, fast enough is quite vague, so how do you know if it's really fast enough? Well, it all depends on how quickly your subject is moving. If your subject is moving slowly or isn't moving at all, then all you really need to worry about is not introducing camera shake into the photo. Now, you can use the rule of thumb that your shutter speed should be at least 1 over the focal length that you're using. So if you're shooting with a 200mm lens, then your shutter speed should be at least 1/200th of a second. Now, if you have a fast-moving subject, then a shutter speed range of 1/500th to 1/2000th of a second is a good choice. And if you have an incredibly fast subject, or if you have a subject like you do here, with very fast-moving wings, then you're going to need a shutter speed from 1/4000th to up to 1/8000th of a second. But you don't always want to completely stop the action of your subject. In the case of shooting landscapes, for example, there's often a component of the scene that would benefit by showing off its motion. And to do this effectively, you want to use a slow shutter speed. So slow, in fact, that you're going to need a tripod most of the time. This first example is using a relatively fast shutter speed, considering the slow movement of the water. At 1/100th of a second, the motion of the water is almost completely frozen. By slowing the shutter speed down to 1/4 of a second, you begin to see a little bit more movement and power from the water. Now, if you had VR turned on, you may be able to handhold this photo, but a tripod is still recommended. Now, this last photo was shot using a 4-minute long exposure, and it required not only a tripod, but a neutral density filter to allow such a long shutter speed to be used. Now, while a little bit more thought and effort has to go into a photo like this, it really gives you a sense of motion that you otherwise would never see. If you want to show motion in a landscape photo, all you really need is a long shutter speed and a tripod. But it gets a little trickier when you want to show the motion of a moving subject. Now, if you use a slower shutter speed while your camera is stationary, but your subject is moving, the resulting focus will still be on the surrounding landscape and not on the subject itself. And things change very quickly, though, when your camera is no longer on a tripod and instead follows the subject. Now, this brings us to a technique called panning, which really helps bring out the speed and motion of your subject. You'll be using a slower shutter speed, which shows the movement, but because you're smoothly following the subject with your lens, parts of the subject will be kept relatively sharp. If you use a slower shutter speed, or if you pan quicker, you'll be able to create a blurrier background. Notice that when a fast shutter speed is used, the resulting photo is a good action shot, but it doesn't help convey the speed or power from the water. When you use a much slower shutter speed, it really gives a sense of movement from the water, but also from the surfer as well. Now, here are a few tips for trying to pan with your subject. Number 1, switch your mode to shutter priority. This allows you to set the shutter speed while the camera will pick the corresponding aperture value that'll give you the proper exposure. Now, you can also shoot in full manual mode, but it requires you to worry about a few more settings that can be distracting if you're new to this technique. Select a shutter speed that's appropriate for your subject. A good starting place for most people is 1/100th of a second. But if you find there isn't enough motion in the photo, you can lower the shutter speed. And if the subject is moving too quickly, you can always raise it. Find a spot where your subject will be moving laterally across from you, as it becomes much more difficult to get a sharp subject if they're coming directly at you. Pan at the same speed as your subject, and don't abruptly stop even once you're done shooting the sequence. Make sure your movements are smooth, because you could end up with unusual blur patterns if you don't use fluid and smooth movements for the entire pan. Keep VR turned on. One of the great things about Nikon's VR system is that it'll automatically detect when you pan, canceling the image stabilization in that direction. Turn on the continuous drive mode. This enables you to get more than one shot per sequence, which greatly improves the chances of getting a great shot. And finally, practice, practice, and practice. You need to be ready for your keeper percentage to go down when you first start trying this technique, as you'll be shooting a lot to try to get the hang of it. So just because you have a moving subject doesn't mean that you always have to use a fast shutter speed. If you slow the motion down and try a panning technique, every once in a while you'll be able to get great artistic looking shots that are different than the action photos that you normally take.